Last night, I listened to a video discussion between my two favorite activists on YouTube, Telltale Atheist and the John Cedars channel, Lloyd Evans. And I've particularly liked Lloyd and have been following Lloyd for many years now. I suppose it's about 3 years. I discovered Telltale quite by accident, and I listened to them separately, wondering what they thought of each other, and I found out last night, very pleasantly surprised, because I think both of them really bring quite a bit to the activist movement. I like both of their styles, although they're quite different. They both bring logic to the table and are doing a great work. But their focus is Jehovah's Witnesses. And Jehovah's Witnesses are, it's not a trivial matter. There are millions of Jehovah's Witnesses. I came from the Bible student background, and you can kind of think of the Bible students as the forerunners or the original cult that led to the more strict, restrictive cult. What And they even talked about that idea of a cult and the negative element to it by saying, talking to people and saying, well, you're in a cult. It might just turn individuals off. But the fact of the matter is that these are high control groups. You go to Freedom of Mind, Stephen Hassan, and both the Bible students and the Jehovah's Witnesses fit the bill of a high control group. However, the key difference, not only in numbers or size, the Jehovah's Witnesses outrank the Bible students, but also in degree of organization. They have a small group of 7 individuals whose word cannot be defied or questioned without repercussions. And so they really are a high control group in the sense that a living, dynamic group of individuals who can respond to and are responsible for current situations and conditions, such as how to set policy for, let's say, child abuse within their ranks. They exist, whereas the Bible students still follow the writings of Charles Taze Russell. Now, Charles Taze Russell formed the Bible Students movement, and he personally claimed himself to be the first Bible student as far back as 1869, when he heard Joseph Wendell give a sermon, I guess. Joseph Wendell was a former Second Adventist or follower of William Miller. You have to know a little about Watchtower history in order to understand the sequence of events and how the Bible students came to be and how the Bible students transformed into the Watchtower Jehovah's Witnesses sect. Not all Bible students did, obviously, because I grew up in the Bible students movement. In fact, when the Jehovah's Witnesses first formed, there probably were more Bible students in existence than there were Jehovah's Witnesses. But that changed quickly under the dictatorial reign or authoritarian control of Joseph Rutherford, who organized the work of witnessing and emphasized the witnessing and made up the difference pretty quickly, and by the time of his death had more than recouped the losses that occurred during his tenure. But it's interesting to think that the movement, under the auspices of the Watchtower, because the Watchtower magazine was first published in 1879. I believe it was August of 1879, right after a break with Nelson Barber. There was a 3 or 4 year collaboration between Russell and Nelson Barber, who was also a Second Adventist and influenced Russell quite a bit in terms of chronology and Bible dating, and especially concerning the coming of the Second Advent and the nature of that Advent being an invisible coming. And they had predicted that Christ had come in 1874, invisibly. There was a break, and the break between Nelson Barber, and this is interesting because I went to the Watchtower headquarters in Warwick, joined Lloyd and his family on an excursion to the headquarters, where there's a museum of the history of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, and it goes back to Russell's day, and some of the influences of Charles Russell and Nelson Barber is conspicuously missing. George Stetton and George Storrs, and I believe his name is Henry Grew, were early influences to Russell, in particular Storrs and Stetton, and they brought elements of dispensationalism to Russell, also other doctrines such as hell and the immortal soul, that there is no immortal soul, that there is no hell, that the dead are asleep in non-existence except for whatever memory that God retains of them in his head, and that Jesus was the ransom for Adam and his transgression. Now, Nelson Barber was a more active individual, and he was publishing a paper, and Russell accidentally got his hands on one of these tracts, and the concepts that were being published by Barber were so similar to what Russell had finally concluded that he decided to contact Barber, and they entered into a collaboration. They even wrote a book together called The Three Worlds. It's like an early version of the first volume of the Divine Plan of the Ages that is attributed to Charles Russell, and when he wrote or began his 6-volume series of studies in the scriptures. And Russell was a prolific writer, and over a nearly 40-year period until his death in 1916, Russell had quite extensive volume of writings. He was published. He was probably the most well-known pastor in the world at the time. He was syndicated. He published a sermon in at least 2,000 newspapers by the turn of the century. And on a weekly basis, he also published The Watchtower and was the key. He called himself the editor, but he really wrote the articles for all of the Watchtowers, and they were sizable magazines. And they came out bi-monthly, and what I mean by monthly, there were 2 a month. Bi-monthly is sort of an ambiguous. It's not once every 2 months. His publication was 2 magazines a month, and Watchtower did that for quite some time. I didn't really mean to get into so much history, but for 50 years, the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society was associated with the Bible Students Movement. And I knew many of the original Bible students that worked at Bethel in New York before the Jehovah's Witnesses came to be. And there was a schism or split or several splits following the death of Russell. One was the Layman's Home Missionary under Paul Johnson, PSL Johnson. The other was the Pastoral Bible Institute. And by the 1930s, the last major split was the Dawn Bible Students Association, and they were the ones that my family became associated with. My family having been come into association with Russell and the Watchtower work, Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, even before they moved out of Pittsburgh or Allegheny. Allegheny at the time was considered a separate city from Pittsburgh, like Brooklyn was a separate city from New York until 1900. And then in 1900, New York incorporated Brooklyn. The same situation was with Allegheny. Now, there is no Allegheny. It's all Pittsburgh. But aside from that, the key doctrine that Russell felt was and we Bible students, as I was taught and raised to believe, was the topic of forgiveness, the ransom doctrine, how God was to restore humankind to his original purpose, that God doesn't do anything in vain, and that he knew beforehand that Satan was going to tempt Eve, and Adam and Eve were going to transgress his law, forbidding them to partake of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which is kind of an odd sort of thing, because if humankind didn't have some sense of innate good and evil and to distinguish between the two, then how are we any different, or how would we have been any different from any other high order mammal? We have this sense that we call morality. When a lion attacks another lion, or let's say in the natural world, in the savannas of Africa, when a lion is a pride is ruled by a single male, and this is true of many mammals. And they have a harem of females, and the male every so often has to defend his harem, and he is the dominant. If he maintains control and he wards off other males, then his genes. This is a part of evolution. His genes are superior, and they're passed on to subsequent generations. As the male ages, younger males come along and challenge the male, and if he's not up to the task, he's either driven off or killed by a younger male, who then becomes the dominant lion of the pride, and then his genetics is passed on. Now, if there are any cubs that had been born to the previous dominant male in the pride, the new leader of the pride will often kill them right off. He doesn't let them live. And that is a natural thing. And we don't call that murder. Lions don't think of that as murder. They don't. This is just a natural instinct. And so this idea of what's good and what's evil, if we did the same thing, humans, we would call that murder, and we would put the person who murdered the youth in jail. We would try them and then put them in jail for murder. We have laws. We have these laws that how we are to interact with one another, and these are social mores that we hold as principles that can't be undermined. That these are fundamental principles of being human. Of course, we often attribute these principles to God, and because the Bible said man partook of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that suddenly we were imbued with this sense of morals, that it was wrong to kill. And under the Ten Commandments, it was codified that thou shalt not kill, and so human life became a valuable thing that should not be taken. So this idea of good and evil is a strange thing, that God would prohibit humankind from that, partaking of that tree, to have that knowledge. The explanation was so that they may become gods. And it seemed to be a desirable thing to Eve, and she was deceived by the devil and partook of the fruit, and then gave to her husband, and he ate. And that was in direct disobedience to God. And how would he know that it was wrong if he didn't partake of the tree of good and evil to know the difference between what's good and wrong? So it's kind of an ironic thing to put this expectation on human beings when human beings aren't imbued innately with this sense of right and wrong and good and evil, to understand that disobeying God's word would be wrong, would be evil, and then to hold them to it. And it says that when they ate, then they realized what they had done was wrong, and they put fig leaves on and covered themselves. But it doesn't make sense when you think about it. But the fundamental doctrine here is that Christianity says that God straightway, knowing that this was going to happen, was going to make a provision to recoup humankind from this condition, from the sentence of death. And he spoke to them and condemned the snake for the serpent for having done what he had done, and cursed him and said that the seed of the woman would crush his head, which when you crush the head of a snake, of course, you kill them. So it implies that something was going to happen to rectify the set of circumstances through the seed of the woman. But when you stop and you think about the whole set of circumstances, for one thing, is it wrong can you blame Adam and Eve for being curious about what good and evil is and wanting it and making, the devil, the serpent, said it was a desirable thing, and Eve saw the logic of it, and she partook, and Adam partook of it too, for what many hold to be various reasons. Most often you hear, or I've heard over the years as a Bible student, that he so loved Eve that he couldn't trust that God was going to help get her out or forgive her, and that he chose death knowingly, because he couldn't stand not being with Eve, because he knew that she'd be sentenced to death. Well, that itself is not an ignoble thing. And I could see myself wanting to do something like that if this God that I don't know, I don't have much history with this God in how he's going to act, because apparently before all of this there was no sin. There was nothing to have any experience with God in terms of how he deals with disobedience. We as parents, we have any of us who have had children, We know that our children are going to disobey us, and there are times when they, especially when they start reaching the age of 2, they know what they want and what they don't want, but they don't understand necessarily the overall reasons why we might, as a parent, prohibit them from doing something. And they call that the terrible twos, and they will often throw a little tantrum or a fit, and to them it's the end of the world. And as a parent, you punish them by some manner, sitting them in a chair or taking away the toy, or in some sense, you guide them that disobedience is wrong, and you've given them some experience as to how you're going to handle that. Obviously, Adam hadn't had that opportunity. So, was it fair that he should trust God when he had no previous experience with God and how he dealt with disobedience? And he really didn't understand death, apparently. I mean, if you believe the Bible account, that it's very likely Adam didn't see anything die. Here's that crazy phone. I apologize. That was my daughter. We've been babysitting all day, and now they're taking a nap, and she's on her way home to pick up our grandson. So that's why I had taken this opportunity to do some recording. So, where were we? Adam not having had any experience. And so, and when you stop and you think about it too, you, as a parent, you wouldn't be so extreme for a punishment. For example, you wouldn't tell your child, don't eat that last cookie in the cookie jar on pains of death. I mean, it just doesn't work that way. I mean, the penalty must be commensurate with the offense. And that's what we try to do as parents, is to show and teach our children that there is a fairness in this world, that certain offenses are more serious than others, and we try to imbue them with a knowledge of it's better to do what's right and tell the truth. It usually works out better for you, and these principles that we as humans innately have. I do believe that religion is not the source of these principles of right and wrong and good and evil and of love. These are all natural within us. These are just a part of us as human beings, and that they were hijacked by religion. And every culture that we know of, people have the same sets of emotions. Paul, what's his name? Dr. Paul Ekman, who learned about microexpressions and dealt with the concept of microexpressions. His thesis when he became a psychologist was to show that certain emotional expressions are universal. And he went to Papua New Guinea, and his research was done back in the mid '60s, um, where he contacted tribes that hadn't been in contact with the Western world, and he devised experiments in which individuals were asked to create facial expressions for certain emotions, and lo and behold, the facial expressions were the same as with every other culture in the world. And this was in contrast to Margaret Mead, who uh, asserted that facial expressions and gestures, human bodily gestures, um, were learned traits, and that they were cultural in nature, and they are. I mean, to a certain degree. I mean, the we give the middle finger to a person. We know what that means in America, in the United States, and much of the world. What the middle finger is to an Italian. You hit the inside of your elbow with your left arm, and you make your right arm go up. You know that gesture. That means the same thing. It's a totally different gesture. It's a cultural gesture, and that's what she was saying about certain facial expressions, that they were culturally learned. And Ekman showed that they were not. That there are certain fundamental human emotions, and that they were expressed universally the same way, and therefore it's a evolutionary trait of humankind as we progressed as a species on this planet. And it was groundbreaking research. And so we this idea of good and evil and right and wrong, and our emotions of contempt and anger and happiness and surprise and other universal, there are 7 such universal emotions, and we all express them the same way. And so that absolutely proves that the Bible really usurped these innate principles and responses and characteristics and emotions and emotional responses to themselves, and said that it originated with God. And the Catholic Church came up with their 7 deadly sins and so on. But one of the biggest and most fundamental doctrines in just about all Christian religions, and this is true, especially true with the Bible students and with the Jehovah's Witnesses, is this concept of God's forgiveness, Christian forgiveness. And it is a concept that we are to forgive. Jesus said, if a man sues you in the court of law, turn your face, and if he slaps you, turn the other cheek and let him slap the other cheek. And if he sues you in court and takes your coat, give him something else. And this whole idea of forgiving and doing so at the expense of yourself is a huge thing in the Bible. The idea that Jesus died for humanity, and the Bible students are very explicit for the reason why Jesus died, and Jesus was a corresponding price as a ransom. And Russell called this a cornerstone doctrine. In fact, this is the very reason why he broke with Barber. And they had an ongoing argument, running argument in first the Herald, which was Barber's paper, and then Russell explained his break from Barber in the first issue of the Watchtower magazine in 1879. And so this was of utmost importance to Russell, and this idea of forgiveness, and that God's forgiveness is complete and all encompassing, and that He gave the most dear thing to Him, His Son, to release humankind from the condition of sin that they had fallen into as a result of original sin. And they use many scriptures, as in Adam all die, even so in Christ shall all be made alive. And Russell attributed this to Adam and Eve, and which he had considered to be one, because the scriptures say that the two twain shall be one flesh when Adam and Eve got together in the Garden of Eden, Eve's creation, and that Eve was taken from Adam in his rib. So she was really considered a part of Adam, in Russell's words, and that Jesus' sacrifice for Adam's transgression covered Eve on that basis, and that Jesus offered himself as a substitution for Adam and in his transgression. Now, there's a problem there in that. First off, Adam, I think the penalty of death was quite severe. I mean, a God that would put someone to death when they were innocent of, in a condition of innocence, as I said earlier, and that they had no prior experience with God, and His exercise of justice and judgment was harsh. It was wrong. It was wrong to sentence him to death. I mean, we wouldn't put our own children to death for just about any violation. I don't know how a parent could ever do that to a child. It's just unimaginable. And Adam was supposed to be God's child, but that's what we're taught in this Bible. It's so warped. And then God made propitiation for the sins of Adam through the giving of His own Son. And it was necessary, absolutely necessary, according to Russell and to Russell's subsequent his successors in the Watchtower, that it was essential that it was a man for a man, that a perfect man had to be given for a perfect man's life to pay the penalty, to pay the proper price, a substitution. Now, in a court of law, humans, we we wouldn't do that. Now, think of this. I mean, there is no justice in someone having committed a crime worthy of death or the death penalty, and someone else who has not committed that sin, that particular sin, worthy of death, to offer himself as a substitution for the person who committed the crime so that he can release that person from death and the death penalty, and he would take it on himself. That's not justice, no matter what. And regardless of the fact that, no man can offer himself a ransom to another. I mean, this 5th chapter of Romans where Paul talks about justification and the need for Jesus to be a perfect man. Well, Jesus was more than just a perfect man. And I'm not talking about the traditional Christian belief that Jesus was a deity and, that the Jews were guilty of deicide, that he was God on earth, and all that other crazy stuff. But Jesus did have a heavenly realm that Adam didn't have. Jesus was supposedly the Logos, the first made, Michael, the archangel, and that he was one of the 2 morning stars, as indicated in the book of Job, when the morning stars sang together in joy, and so on. And he was supposedly, in that existence, and that God transformed him into a man and impregnated a virgin. And there's so much about this misunderstanding and mistranslation about a virgin shall, get pregnant and all that. I'm not going to get into that. I'm just talking about the idea that it wasn't simply a perfect man giving his life up for a perfect man in a ransom. Jesus had given up his entire existence and sacrificed that existence in heaven to come to earth to be a man, to be sacrificed as a man for Adam, as a substitution for Adam, and to pay the price of Adam's transgression. It's just not right. It's not equality. It is not the balance of justice. All of our courts have, they used to have the 10 Commandments. Thank goodness they are getting away from that. But the court systems, all of our justice systems, you see the image of the woman with the blindfold over her eyes and holding the balances of justice, and that the suggesting that the punishment is to be equal to the crime, and that justice is blind, and we are to be as fair as possible. There's nothing fair. There's nothing equal at all in any of the concepts that are offered in the Bible, in any faith, especially in the Bible students and in the Jehovah's Witnesses, who maintain that Jesus had to be a perfect man in order to offer himself as a ransom. And all of this is an expression of God's forgiveness of humankind and what was necessary to take place to express that forgiveness. And this is how God loved the world. God so loves the world that he gave his only begotten Son. And so that this concept of justice and equality is connected directly and correlated directly to love and the idea of Christian love. And this is where we see in horrific crimes, because I don't think that there are any other mammals on this planet, probably no other creatures on this planet that do so much harm to one another as humans do. Yes, we see violence in the animal kingdom, but not anywhere near the violence within species as we do in the human species. The human, as far back as we know in recorded human history, there have been very few periods of peace. And there have been very, very few periods in which humankind has had any level of justice. I mean, 95% of the population had nothing, whereas 5% had all of the wealth. And that's the way it's been for most of recorded history. and we see this throughout human history, and we see these. We have the 30 Years' War and the 100 Years' War, and we study all of this in Western Civ. We talk about the turning points of Western history, the Greeks' repulsion of the Persians and how critical that was, and how often things could have gone so differently in our history. And in British history alone, we have the invasion of William the Conqueror and how that altered British history tremendously. And we have wars and wars and wars, and also periods in which there have been vast pestilences like bubonic plague, in which the human spirit was lost, and the idea, the value of a human life was diminished. I mean, even today, which is the best period of human history, we see atrocities. The 20th century alone, the most enlightened century alone that we've of humans' history, there were 231 million deaths attributed to wars, and we had two major wars: World War I, World War II. Where literally tens of millions of people died as a result of those wars, both soldiers, military, and civilians. But the 20th century was rife with war, with conflicts, and we had the Korean War only at 5 years after the Second World War. Just within 5 years of that war, we were back into conflict again. These were described as the wars to end all wars. World War I. 23 years later, we have the Nazi invasion of Czechoslovakia and Poland, and we entered into World War II, and the United States was a part of many of these conflicts in Korea and in Vietnam, and we got into these paranoias. I mean, there's a big wall in Washington, D.C. I know a couple of names on that wall of people I knew that died in Vietnam, and it just it's just humans are terribly cruel to one another, and there's no other species on the earth like it. And now, for the last 50 years, we've had nuclear power, nuclear weapons that could wipe off humanity from the face of the earth. And it's not only humanity, it could wipe off every living species on the surface of the earth. So, what are the chances of us getting through the 21st century or into the 22nd century? Are they good? I mean, if we get some extremist who believes that they are looking towards doing God's will. I mean, there's a series of books called it's like a comic series, and these are evangelical Christians who forget the name of the series. I'm going to have to check it just a second. I apologize. It just came to mind as I turned it off, and it's called the Left Behind series. And these have been very immensely popular, and they are very graphic. Comic novels. I guess there's this new genre called graphic novel that is very popular, and that's what I think these tend to be. And the Christians are looking forward to the end of humanity, and they act as if this world that we live on is a disposable earth. That it's no more worth to God and to anything. Any more worth than an empty McDonald's hamburger wrapper that you crumple up and throw away. I mean, the earth has little value other than being the place that God puts humankind and to test and sorts them out as the sheep and the goats and then destroys the world through Armageddon, and the faithful go to heaven and for eternal bliss, and the evil go to hell for eternal torment. That's the evangelical idea, and that this earth really doesn't have any value to them with that kind of a viewpoint. That this diversity of species, this wondrous planet with its balanced ecosystems, and evolution has found marvelous niches for creatures for life to live and to thrive, and all of that has taken place over millions and millions of years, and we could destroy all of that and humanity with it, with a nuclear exchange. The only things left living would be thousands of feet down at the bottom of these sea vents. And there's not much chance that life would re-evolve and populate the contaminated surface of the earth from that point forward. And so it's a dire situation. And, me personally, even though I'm an atheist and I am destined to hell by the Christian faiths, the Christian, the typical evangelical or Catholic religions, I'm destined to go to hell. To Bible students and Jehovah's Witnesses, I'm destined to forever of non-existence, which is supposed to be better. Um, if perchance I counted myself to be one of the saved, let's say I get a conversion and praise Jesus as my Lord and Savior and become one of the saved, and let's say peradventure this phantasmagorical travesty comes true and God does destroy the earth through Armageddon, and there's this nuclear exchange, and the non-believers and the evil people go to hell for torment, and all of the good people, Christians, go to heaven. I'm not sure that I could be happy knowing that there are billions of people in hell suffering forever. And how can one count Satan as God's adversary if there are billions upon billions of people in hell suffering? He's doing God's bidding. So how is Satan God's adversary in that sense? I don't get it. He would be doing God's will. He's a part of God's plan, and I couldn't be happy in a knowing that this amazing world with such diversity and such beauty and so much the ecology and how it all interacts, and what a waste that all of that would be just destroyed. What a waste. Is God doesn't care? I mean, he's had, according to the Bible, he's always existed, which means that there's a forever in the past. He's had a hell of a long time to think about how to do things the best way, and this is the best he can come up with. This does not sound like an omniscient God. This doesn't sound like a God that's loving. This sounds like, something that some flawed humans devised. And these, and it doesn't matter even really what religion that you believe. Even the Eastern religions have their flaws. I mean, ultimately, the goal is not to attain a life here on earth that is joyful. It's always this nirvana and heavenly hope that we will eventually enjoy being gods on another plane. And what the heck is wrong with our planet? And being human and learning the laws of nature and science and advance the human condition and advance the human mind. And I mean, we can do amazing things. I mean, science has proven that. What good was it all? If why would God give us this capacity just so that it's all for naught? I mean, it just doesn't make sense. And the reason it doesn't make sense is because today, with the scientific method, today with our expanded mathematics, today with our expanded and better understanding of the natural world, it's increasingly incongruous with a 2,000-year-old book that was devised by desert dwellers who had limited ideas of justice and who lived in a harsh world. So when these Christians, when you see, my wife loves these crime shows, and you inevitably you see some heinous crime, and the person has been finally caught, a serial killer. He's a psychopath. He has no remorse. He can't feel remorse because he is a sociopath or a psychopath, and he gets pleasure from hurting, and he's taken $50 billion from society and turned the economy upside down like Bernie Madoff, and these these guys, and often the people who have been hurt the most say, I forgive. They get a chance to get a voice at the sentencing, and I, in my because of my Christian belief, I forgive all that he's done, and I love him. I've come to forgive and love. And this idea, again, as I mentioned earlier, forgiveness in the Christian sense is linked with love because of the scripture, God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten son. So God's forgiveness was the ultimate expression of love. And so if you forgive someone, you must love them. That's the Christian correlation. And it's not always healthy to try and love a person that has done something that they're not remorseful for. Now, I remember my father-in-law having a bad experience with one of the Bible students' ecclesias or congregations that he was in. And when I first met him, when I met my wife and we got married, he used to come over to our little apartment to have meetings because his wife didn't like, she was not a Bible student, and she didn't like talking about, having discussions about Bible student doctrine in the home. So he'd come over to our apartment, and we had these little meetings on Sunday. And on occasion, he would tell this story about his experience with the Washington, D.C. Bible Students Ecclesia. And being an engineer, he was always very analytic, matter of fact, and he would try to, like NASA, you never hear NASA get excited, even when everything is ready to blow up. Their voices are as steady as a rock, and he was like that. He worked for the U.S. government. And he would tell this story. His voice would be rock steady, and he'd slow his voice in pace. But it was so traumatized because this was an experience that led to his being expelled from the class, and it traumatized him. And he would tell this story. His voice was as steady as a rock, as calm sounding as could be, but you would begin to see his Celtic complexion, pale complexion, begin to redden and get deeper and deeper red. He was more and more flushed in his face, and then as the story progressed, the beads of sweat would form on his forehead, and then his hands would begin to shake. And he was reliving this experience, and he had done so for the entire time I had known him, for 30 years, until he passed away. He couldn't get over that particular situation. Now, forgiveness has two definitions. The Merriam-Webster definition is one in which I believe is the more healthy idea of what forgiveness is about. The Merriam-Webster idea is, in essence, in its definition, to stop feeling angry or resentful toward someone for an offense, flaw, or mistake. Holding on to anger is evidence that you're still connected emotionally to those who hurt you. Letting go of that anger allows one to live life more happily and free of malicious feelings. Anger causes the body to respond in a way that is detrimental to you. After all, we are creatures that evolved into existence between some 150 and 300,000 years ago. So our emotional responses today don't recognize the things that cause us to respond emotionally, anger or fright. Our bodies react with the same chemical reactions, adrenaline reactions, as 100,000 years ago, in the savannas of North America, when a saber-toothed cat leaped out of its hiding place and stalking us, and we needed every ounce of energy to do feats that we normally couldn't physically do to preserve our life. Today, we don't live with that kind of danger of trying to escape from a cave bear or some other predator that's higher on the food chain. Today, we respond to conditions under work, let's say the workplace and our boss and hierarchy of status and stature, and but our bodies don't recognize the difference, and it can cause harm. It can cause detriment to us to have to withhold or to restrain ourselves from the normal fight or flight response that comes naturally to us. Our technology and our society has changed much more rapidly than our bodies have been able to adapt from an evolutionary point of view. But what's even more, that's why finding ways to cope and to diffuse anger is important for us. And if we don't find ways of coping with circumstances in this life, it can have detrimental health effects on us. And that's why many of us die of cardiovascular diseases, because we do react in the way that we would react 100,000 years ago. But what could be even more harmful to us is to react with the Christian sense of forgiveness, of having to love the one that perpetrated a horrific or an egregious offense against us. And so many times you hear that people who've lost a loved one at the hand of a psychopath, or somebody who's been severely raped, that the victims, the parents that are left behind or the relatives that are left behind, will often say that they have forgiven the person and that they love them. And why should they love them? Why should they have to go through the pains of trying to do something that really doesn't come natural to us? I mean, after all, these individuals, they feel no remorse. There was a study done in New Brunswick or Newfoundland prisons in Canada, and um, the individuals. You can find this. Discussion and study on YouTube about psychopaths, and that they found that at least 25% of the individuals who committed crimes and were in prison were met the criteria for psychopath, and this criteria has been recently revised so that it's very accurate. These individuals indeed are psychopaths. They would just as readily do it again and be happy doing whatever horrible thing it is they've done again. They have no feelings. They have no empathy. They have no remorse. They are incapable of loving anything but themselves. And so why it's got to be unhealthy for you to you in the rhetorical sense to bring yourself to love such an individual. These individuals are horrific and would harm as much as they can. For example, Charles Manson was once asked about what he'd do if he was released from prison, and he said he would kill as many people as he possibly could kill, and if it was the whole world, if it was possible to kill the whole world, he would do so. And he meant that. He meant that. Ted Bundy meant it when he said that it was better for society that he was off the streets. And it wasn't because he had some feeling of human empathy that yes, I need to be off because I'm sick. He realized that he enjoyed it too much and that he was going to do it again. He didn't care about the feelings of the people that he had hurt. He just knew that he would do it again and enjoy doing it all over again, the horrible things that he'd done. And this is true with those types of individuals. And so it's unhealthy for you to try and bring yourself to love a person in that Christian sense. And that is, when you go to Wikipedia and you look at the definition of forgiveness, it is it reflects the Christian idea of having a growing compassion for the person, a diminishing animosity towards them, and a growing compassion for the individual that caused the hurt. But these individuals often belong to a group of mentally ill people who, I mean, it's like a person who has no leg. You know, they just aren't going to be able to do something because they're missing that limb. Narcissists and psychopaths and sociopaths, all under the classification of personality disorders, antisocial personality disorders, are people that just have no empathy and have no ability to feel remorse. And so it would be very unhealthy for you to try and force yourself to love such a person in forgiving. Now, learning to cope with the situation and moving on with your life so that you can pick up the pieces and live your life so that you're not reliving the situation over and over again, and trying to make the remainder of your life a happy, healthy, and productive one is, in fact, healthy, and it's the best thing to do. Psychology Today, I found a very short article on this idea of forgiveness, and it supports this idea. And it says most psychologists recommend mustering up genuine compassion for those that have wronged us and moving on from the past instead of allowing the bitterness and anger towards others to eat away at us. And that I endorse. I think that's important for us as individuals to do that in most circumstances. But we can even go further than that with people who feel remorse and are sorry for what they've done. We can love them. We do that with our children and other people that are close to us and have done wrong to us. We can love them again, and there's nothing wrong with that. But there are these cases where it would be wrong for us to try and bring us to this idea of carte blanche Christian love. And the article goes on, it says, although burying the hatchet usually brings peace to the soul, there are exceptions to that advice, such as in the case of sexual abuse. Sometimes a victim becomes more empowered when given permission not to forgive. Equally and perhaps more important is learning to acknowledge your missteps and forgive yourself. Self-forgiveness is often the first step toward a more loving and positive relationship with yourself and therefore with others. You see, in many of these situations, you end up blaming yourself. You don't give yourself. You see, we're the first ones to be the hardest on ourselves when something bad happens in our life, when somebody has done us wrong, and we blame ourselves for the situation. And it's important that we do come to forgive ourselves and to overcome that anger and to begin to move forward with a productive and healthy life. And it's better to confront these things than to just hide and bury them, because when you bury them in your mind, you're just doing yourself a lot of harm. And so I think that there's some good advice here. And when people are in situations where they've been harmed in a very significant and detrimental way, that they get counseling, that they're able to talk with somebody about the situation and to gain help. But forgiveness from a 2,000-year-old book that had no idea of the human mind and how it works can be dangerous to us, can be harmful to us. And so it's the Bible was formed by desert dwelling nomads that lived in a very harsh world, and the ideas that came out of the religions that came from the Middle East are certainly not in congruence with the understanding of the human mind as we understand through scientific studies and the knowledge of how the brain and human emotions work today. So I don't endorse the carte blanche Christian idea of forgiveness, and I think that the entire basis of God's forgiveness is based in this desert dwelling concept of what's right and wrong and how to forgive and why love is connected so strongly to this idea of forgiveness. So those are my thoughts on this, and I think it's important because all of Christianity is based on this idea of forgiveness. If God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, and it's hard to understand how anybody can see that this kind of forgiveness as taught in the Bible is something that can be advocated and accepted and lived by, especially in a world where we have so much better knowledge of how the human mind works. So, anyway, I wish you all well.